Welcome everybody. It is an absolute pleasure for me to have with me today Art and Bena Theory. Art and Bena, I was thinking earlier about when I first sort of came across you, and Art, it was you that I met first, and I think it was in the late 90s. It was a long time ago, and you have both been such a huge influence on my thinking and my career. And it's a pleasure to be able to talk to you today about the habits of mind. So perhaps for our audience that are new to the habits, and I'm not sure, Art or Bena, if you want to take this question, if you could give us a little bit of a history, so where did they come from, how were they derived, and talk us through the beginnings of the habits of mind.
Okay. Many years ago, like in early 1980s, the Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development here in the US invited me to edit a book, which I agreed to, and it was called Developing Minds. And what I did was to write to leaders in philosophy and education and thinking skills and cognition from around the world, and invited them to describe their understanding and their descriptions of effective, successful thinkers. So I wrote to people like Reuven Feuerstein in Israel and Edward de Bono in Malta, Guy Claxton in England, David Perkins at Harvard, and so on. So these were leaders in the field from around the world. And they sent me their descriptions of what effective thinkers do. And as I was editing these, I was, of course, reading all of their articles, and I began to see some patterns because many of them were saying the same thing. For example, Reuven Feuerstein said, well, they restrain their impulsivity. And Edward de Bono says, well, they collect all facts before they make a judgment. And David Perkins talked about people who are not good thinkers would be hasty thinkers. And I said, well, what they're all saying is that they think first and act later. And and that was just one of them. There were many similarities. So I began to see these patterns, and I began to kind of collect them and classify them. And I started off with about 7, and then it went to 10, and then 12, and gradually the list began to grow over the years, not just from that book, until now that we have 16. And so they really started by the analysis of what good, effective, efficacious, successful thinkers do. And so I gave labels to them, like they would be able to think well with other people. So they knew how to work in groups and think in groups. So we call it thinking interdependently. And another would say that they could easily shift their thinking from big perspective or narrow perspective from the big picture, or being very analytical, and they were able to take another person's point of view. So we call that flexibility of thinking. So this is how it came to be. And over the years, we have added to the list, and we have never found anything that detracted from the list. We always got reinforced. Bena joined me, and we wrote a book that we have available. And actually, we wrote full books initially, and we changed them to just words like persisting or persistence to an action word. We found that it was better if we talked about acting in action words like persisting rather than persistence. Rather than just talking about cooperation, it was thinking interdependently. Rather than just being amazed at the world, it was responding with wonderment and awe. So we formulated them all into verb forms. And then we wrote our books, and that's how it all started.
And they're the books that I first discovered. I remember years ago, I picked up a whole lot of books, multiple intelligences and thinking skills and Edward de Bono's work. And
Right.
I was plowing through them, and I found your work, and I spent this is the one that sort of sits above. It's the one that captures it all. Can I ask a follow-up question? You said you were researching and reading and editing for that book, Developing Minds, and you reached out to all those researchers, and they were saying effective thinkers did these things, and you saw the similarities and the overlaps and the commonalities
right.
there. Who were the effective thinkers on the other side of their research? Who were they looking at that they were saying these people are doing this thinking well?
Oh, wait a minute. Clarify that. Who was doing the?
So
Who were they?
Who were they researching when they came to these conclusions? What people were they looking at?
Yes. Well, I didn't pursue that to find out who they were considering to be good thinkers, but I did read their writings, and the ones that I mentioned were not the only ones. There were other two: Robert Schwartz, Robert Ennis, and so on. Were additional people. So it was from their own writings that they had analyzed what effective thinkers did, what were their actions and their patterns of behavior. So this is what they reported to me.
Okay, so they were looking at the, sorry, Bena, you were going to say?
No, I was just going to clarify that I think it was from their research in looking at what they would define as effective thinkers. So it's a kind of interesting question, because we never got to the place of saying, you know, what were your criteria? What was the basis of your research? But I think that we were certainly, I mean, I think Art was certainly looking at this question of what are they observing? And also remember, some of them were philosophers. They weren't all people who were working in the academic area of education. Right. A number of them were philosophers, and were very much influenced by people like John Dewey and other, you know, and also people like Jean Piaget. So there was a lot of research that they were resting on the shoulders of, all of which was looking at this question of what develops that cognitive capacity to be a reasoning, analytic, as we sort of try to summarize these days, critical and creative thinker.
Yes, we also, I did ask them, or pursue a little bit, what we mean by successful people. And it was not financial. It's not that the people were rich, but rather that they were goal-oriented, that they had a following, that people admired them, that they had a set of goals in life that they worked toward. And when I say people had a following, I remember I had an automobile mechanic who worked on my car. This was a long time ago, but he worked on my car, and he was very popular. He had a lot of clients and a lot of customers. But he had my car up on a hoist one time, and he was listening to my transmission, and he got out a stethoscope and put it in his ears and held it up to the transmission. And I thought at the time, wow, this is really gathering data with all senses. And it's that kind of thing. The people were very thorough. People that were admired because they were thorough. They were very goal-oriented. And so it was not financial, although that could be, but finance was not the indicator of success. It was more that people had a set of values. They lived by them. They professed them. People had a following to them, and they were successful. And they were people who were doctors and lawyers and auto mechanics, as I said. And it was not that there was any one profession that was examined.
I often ask the people that I work with, who do you consider characteristically successful? Without overthinking the definition, who comes to mind as successful? And I think they're the people that you're talking about, the ones that we don't have to measure it by money or status or prestige, but we just know that these people are successful.
That's it.
Yeah, fair enough. Thank you.
Maybe just to add one little piece to that is
of course, always.
That, I think people who are successful feel confident in the fact that they're doing important, productive, successful work. So there's something about the intrinsic experience that people have that isn't measured by external, but by the kind of experience of knowing that they're doing something that's well done.
Yeah.
Good.
I wonder, and I don't want to make this interview about me, but this the definition I've come to use in that context, and I wonder if this would apply to the people you've talked about, is that success is about achieving a goal that requires effort, doing hard things, growing, developing, not just doing easy things. And I wonder if that's what the people you're talking about were recognizing.
Sure.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is the challenge of knowing that you're never there. I think when we talk about habits of mind, people want to know, well, you know, how do you know if you're exemplary, if you're mastering, if you're completed? And I think we always feel that the true person who is feeling successful in their work is also always growing, always curious, always creatively looking for what's the next move, what's the next thing. And I think that's very much in line with a lot of the work that you do on the Agile Learner and on really thinking about the growth mindset and imagining. So if there is no end in mind, is that satisfying? And I think for people who are dispositionally oriented, as we have defined them, we would say, yes, that's very satisfying.
Thank you for tying that up so well.
We, based on those descriptions of what successful people did, we formulated a theory, and that theory is that if those indeed are the attributes and dispositions and characteristics of successful people, then could we teach them in school so that students would be successful as well? That's really how we got started. And so we took the set of habits of mind and helped teachers infuse them into their curriculum and instruction so that kids would learn these habits that would be successful to them, not only in school, but throughout their life.
Yeah, which raises the interesting question. It's been 25 years or more now that we've been working around that space.
That's right.
What have we seen? What have been some of the success stories from working in, let's start with schools, in that time? When schools have adopted the habits of mind, what sort of outcomes have resulted?
Yes.
Well, if we took and matched up the definition we just gave for success, we would say that those school cultures had success because of what we really observed, which is the continuous learning, the growing, the interest in growing a culture, the challenge of meeting new situations and trying to think flexibly. I mean, I think what we've learned most, again, is that people who get deeply committed to habits of mind are really those people who are, as a school culture, we see that the whole culture reflects that new teachers coming in reflect the curiosity, the investigative quality of it, the idea that good teaching never ends in terms of pursuit of good teaching, and that we're always looking to see how do we respond more effectively with students? How do we engage students? All of the questions that I think as educators trouble us, struggle, and also give us the joy and the feeling of accomplishment when we see the lights in the kids' eyes, that I got it, I understand this, I really am excited about this. So it's really, I think it's really, in so many ways, I guess people would say it's ephemeral, but I think it's not. I think it's in the air. It's in the dust of the school. I think when you walk in, you almost know immediately whether it's happening, even when there aren't very specific signs about it, but you hear the way people talk, you hear the way they are constantly challenging themselves, and you hear that they're very consciously using the language of the habits because they've really said that this is what they really believe. And we just had a beautiful example from a teacher who wrote to us and said, in COVID, here's what I'm really understanding. Here's how I'm being challenged to be thinking flexibly. And here's what I'm learning about listening with understanding and empathy. In other words, this teacher, and I think she's also a school leader, she is, now that I think about it, is really saying, you know, this is what I'm really recognizing is something that is so critical to meeting the challenge of what this pandemic is putting upon us. So it's saying it's not only that it's important in the long run, but it's also so responsive to the immediacy of the challenging situations that we live in on a daily basis.
Yeah, I think there's some additional supportive to support that notion about the importance of it and how it has long-lasting effect. A couple of things. One is that at Waikiki School in Hawaii, which is the longest the school with the longest history of habits of mind, they did two things. One of the teachers did her doctoral study to follow up with students going on into middle school and high school, and did they use the habits of mind when they were confronted with problems. So she searched out the graduates of the school and went to them and gave them problems to solve. And yes, students did indeed refer to the habits of mind to help them solve those problems. Another thing that Waikiki did just this last year was to seek out graduates of their school who had taken positions in like the state government and went on into jobs into Hawaiian culture. And they invited them to school and they interviewed them to find out what the habits of mind meant to them. And yes, those habits of mind are long lasting. The people said that they still use them in their job as doctors, as nurses, or whatever. The other thing is, a third, I think, very important one is that we have found, and James, you will know this, we have found that they're universal. We have schools, as you well know, in Australia, and you helped with some in South Africa and New Zealand and Hong Kong and Cambodia and England and Wales. And so there's a universal quality. It's not just in one culture, but it is pan-cultural or trans, what's the word I'm saying? It is used throughout the world, and all cultures seem to find a home and the application of the habits of mind.
Beautiful. So we've painted a lovely picture there from saying that we observed, or not we, you observed through other people's research, these high achieving people, these people that were characteristically successful,
Right.
Identified the habits of mind, asked the question, can we teach those to kids? Have followed those kids through in schools like Waikiki, and to see them rise to their own success as adults and engaging in those habits of mind. So you painted a lovely picture of how we saw what successful people were doing, asked, can we teach them to young children? And when we do, what happens? And you've said that we've seen that same pattern follow through, which is beautiful.
Yeah, I think there's one more too. Over the years, and most recently, we have learned from leaders and authors in the field, like Tony Wagner and others, who have described what are the needs in an environment that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. You know those. What are the skills that are necessary? And indeed, while they don't call them necessarily the same thing, but they think, you have to be able to communicate well. Well, yes, we agree with that. We want called listening with understanding and empathy, and communicating with precision, thinking and communicating with clarity. You have to be able to work cooperatively. Well, yeah, we said this, thinking interdependently is the most part of it. We have to think creatively. We have to think. So in other words, those same skills have been reinforced over years with the changing culture and the changing times of the world, those habits of mind still remain as core, essential characteristics of successful people.
And that's the really enduring and beautiful part about the habits, I think, that other people have come up with similar answers, that they said, you know, in a volatile, uncertain, changeable, ambiguous world, we need these sorts of things. And people go, oh yeah, they're the habits of mind. Or someone else is doing research into entrepreneurship and they say they need to persist and they need to do this. They, oh yeah, they're the habits of mind. And personally, that's been one of the huge strengths for me around the habits of mind, is that we come at them from all different angles, and it gives a strength and authenticity to it. I mean, there's a lot of good ideas out there, but I think the beauty that both of you have given to the world is the clarity that you didn't create them. You didn't sit down one day and write a list. You said, what do successful people actually do through that research, and can we help people do it?